of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our Driftless Dialogue. My name is Maggie. I'm the Education Coordinator here at KVR. We're really excited to have Dr. Stanley Temple with us today. He is a senior fellow at the Aldo Leopold Foundation and a professor emeritus at the UW-Madison, and he's been involved in conservation work for a very long time. And he's here today to talk about monarchs and how Aldo Leopold's land ethic can be used by landowners to help promote monarch conservation. So please welcome Dr. Stanley Temple.
Okay. All right, thank you. And I hope some of you will realize the irony of an ornithologist speaking to you on International Migratory Bird Day about monarch butterflies. But hey, it's migrants, and monarch butterflies qualify. So yeah, monarch butterflies, obviously not in any way my specialty, but since I spent my career at the University of Wisconsin in the academic position that Aldo Leopold once held, and in retirement I'm at the Aldo Leopold Foundation, a lot of what I do in terms of public outreach is linking Aldo Leopold and his ideas to current conservation issues. And the monarch butterfly was a perfect candidate because, as you'll see, throughout the second half of his career, Aldo Leopold was almost obsessed with finding ways to get private landowners engaged in conservation practices of all kinds. And it was that challenge of what would it take to get private landowners to basically do the right thing on their land that led him to what many people consider to be one of his most important contributions to conservation, and that's his land ethic. The idea that our relationship with the natural world has to have a moral compass. There has to be an ethic underlying our relationship. And he likened it to the well understood situation that we live in human communities. And when you live in a community, there have to be some agreed upon rules for that community to function normally. And everyone's familiar with the fact that in human communities we have all kinds of constraints on our behavior to be good citizens of the community. Well, Leopold, being an ecologist, reckoned by the same notion that we live in an ecological community and that there have to be some commonly agreed upon rules of how we're going to live in an ecological community, or writ large, the planet Earth. So monarch butterflies, perfect example. How many of you have read a Sand County Almanac? Okay, good. So I don't need to explain that to you. But in the foreword to a Sand County Almanac, Leopold talks about the book and especially the land ethic being the end result of a life journey. And in the course of which he's felt sorrow, anger, puzzlement, and confusion over the inability for conservation to halt the juggernaut of land abuse. So Leopold's life journey is a complicated one, and I'm not going to try to take you through the whole thing, but in the mid-1920s, sort of midway through his professional career, he left the U.S. Forest Service and comes back to the Midwest. He'd spent the first 15 years of his career in Arizona and New Mexico, but he gets transferred to Madison, Wisconsin. Shortly thereafter, quits the Forest Service in frustration because he wants to pursue his real passion, which was not forestry, it was wildlife conservation. So he quits his job with the Forest Service, which was a pretty bold thing to do, given that he had this high-paying, secure government job that really wasn't asking him to do much except pursue his own interests. Got a wife and 5 kids at home. He didn't know the Great Depression was looming on the horizon, but he quits cold turkey to turn his attention to wildlife conservation. But now in a very different landscape, unlike his work with the Forest Service in the Southwest, where he was in charge of millions of acres of publicly owned wildlands, he finds himself here in the Midwest in the 1920s when the landscape was pretty much at its low point. The land had just been badly abused for a century or more. The Dust Bowl was looming. The erosion here in the driftless area was some of the worst in the country. And for Leopold, he recognized that the challenge that he was going to have to confront was dealing with private landowners, that there really was no way to achieve wildlife conservation goals just on public land. There just wasn't enough of it around the eastern half of the country. So when he quits the Forest Service, he takes a contract job doing a survey of wildlife across the upper Midwest. And over 3 years, he travels everywhere, looking at conditions on the ground, interviewing people, looking at historical records. And he realizes that, you know, it's even more challenging than I initially thought. Not only is the land privately owned and difficult to sort of force people to do things, but when he looked at it, it was this tiny little mosaic of individual farms, and doing anything at a scale that would be beneficial to wildlife conservation would involve not only engaging individual landowners, it would involve essentially engaging a landscape, a community with many landowners cobbled together to do the right thing. So, and he realizes, of course, that most of the land in the Midwest is in agriculture. So really the individuals that control most of the potential wildlife habitat are farmers. So his focus really became on farmland and how to get conservation practiced. And he comes home and he writes this book, which is a remarkable insight at the time. He did a couple of things in this. He summarized, obviously, his findings about the crux of the problem, you know, being on private land. But in addition, he had a paradigm-changing view of what needed to happen. Up to that point, 1931, if you were engaged at all in wildlife conservation, you were there to protect wildlife. If you were a professional, your job was almost certainly a game warden. You were there to enforce laws. And that was the prevailing sort of paradigm that governed how we tried to achieve conservation goals with wildlife. After he had done this tour of the Midwest and saw what the real problem was, that not only was it on private land, but it was the habitat. It was the condition of the land that was responsible for this miserable condition of wildlife in the Midwest in the 1920s. It's hard to imagine now that white-tailed deer were virtually gone from the landscape. Wild turkeys were gone. Sandhill cranes were virtually gone. There's just a whole host of species that had reached pretty much their low point because of what we had done to the land. I always find it amusing that back then in the 1930s, the Wisconsin Conservation Department actually had a captive breeding program for raccoons. They were captive breeding raccoons and releasing them around the state because raccoons had become so scarce on the landscape. So Leopold basically, you know, turns this on end and said, no, we're not going to accomplish anything with more game wardens out there on the landscape. We've got to improve the condition of the habitat, and wildlife will come back. So just a couple of years later, he puts his ideas to print in the paradigm-changing book called Game Management. And it was in this book that he introduced to the world this new idea of managing wildlife rather than just protecting them. And he based his ideas, of course, on ecology, that there was a science, ecology, that told us what we needed to do with the environment in order to support healthy wildlife populations. So this book, you know, changed the profession. Pretty much almost in the aftermath of this book, the job description changed from game warden to wildlife manager. We still have game wardens, of course, but wildlife managers now prevail. So 1933 was also a good year for Aldo Leopold because some of his influential friends in Madison lobbied the University of Wisconsin to consider hiring him for a faculty position. This is a long shot if ever there was one. It is the Great Depression now. The university's budget had to be in the tank. Here's this guy, Aldo Leopold, who has no PhD, never taught a course in his life, and represented a new field, wildlife management, that had never before been present in the halls of academia. And the University of Wisconsin, fortunately, decided to take a gamble and did hire him for a faculty position, thanks in no small part to the fact that his influential friends in Madison contributed his salary for the first 5 years. But Leopold now had a home. In academia, he's now got the academic freedom to explore his ideas as widely as he wished. And the dean of the college at the time immediately asked Aldo Leopold, well, you know, we've created this new chair in wildlife management for you. What are you going to do with this new position? And given that this book had just come out, I'm sure the dean thought there was going to be an explanation of how he was going to advance wildlife management. Well, he did that. But in addition, he had this to say: I want to develop some vehicle whereby the community can prevent the abuse of private land and encourage uses which are in the public interest. He's already expanding, I mean, to a completely much larger realm than just talking about wildlife management. He's now talking about this very systemic, fundamental conflict between public's interest in things like water and wildlife and private ownership. And he really goes into it. The last 15 years of his life, until he dies in 1948, is basically devoted to this conundrum. How do we work this out? And you've noticed, I've underlined it now twice, the crux to the problem. When you read Aldo Leopold's writings and essays, when he starts a paragraph with that phrase, pay attention, because what he's going to say is usually a masterpiece of Aldo Leopold condensing a problem down to its essence. And here he is, you know, that the private landowner has these two interests, their own interest and the public's interest. And he goes on to say that all conservation problems, erosion, forestry, game, wildflowers, landscapes, and I'll add butterflies, ultimately boil down to this. How do we get private landowners to do things that are in the public interest? And Leopold, of course, was not sort of trying to tell landowners what to do. He wasn't trying to sort of control them in any sort of way. What he was looking for was a sort of a symbiotic relationship. And he, again, put it very succinctly. When land does well for its owner and the owner does well by his land, when both end up better by reason of their partnership, we have conservation. So he's looking at something that today we might call sustainability, living on the land in a way that preserves the integrity of the natural community, but at the same time allows the owner to make a living on the land. And Leopold, he's a wonderful communicator. Obviously, his writing style is amazing, but he also has a way of boiling down really complex issues to common language. And he did this with his ideas about conservation when he comes up with the concept of land health. Everybody understands what health is in terms of human beings. We know the difference between when we're sick and when we're healthy. We know the symptoms, the signs of health, the symptoms of sickness. So Leopold comes up with this idea that conservation is a state of health in the land. And for Leopold, land, again, was the common terminology that he used for what today we might say the ecosystem or even the biosphere. So he says the land consists of soil, water, plants, and animals. But it's more than just a sufficiency of these. It's a state of vigorous sense of renewal in each of them and in all collectively. Today, we might use the term resilience, that the ecological system is able to absorb the impacts that we have on it and still function normally. But Leopold, using common language, puts it in terms that most people can understand. So Leopold, remember, he's just come from 15 years in the Forest Service. He's in a federal agency that was responsible for vast landscapes of the newly created national forests in the Southwest. His first professional experiences in conservation were basically top-down command and control. As manager of those national forests, what he said is what happened. And he had fiat, as I said, over millions of acres. So when he returns to the Midwest and starts to tackle the issue of private landowners and conservation, his first inclination is to say, by gosh, we'll make them do it by regulations. That worked for me for 15 years. So in 1924, when he's just returned to the Midwest, he had this to say: ultimately, the use of all resources will have to be put under public regulation, regardless of ownership. Well, remember, just a few years later, he did his game survey around the Midwest, and he pretty quickly learned that that was not going to work with the private landowners of the Midwest. They would resent that and probably not comply. So Leopold is a person who is hard to pin down, because throughout his career, he's constantly evolving. And when one of his ideas proves not to be workable, he pivots quickly, seamlessly, no regrets about what I said before. I've changed my outlook. Here's what I'm thinking now. So just a few years later, all the regulations in the world will not save our game unless the farmer sees fit to leave his land in habitable condition for game. So, okay, regulations aren't going to work. What can I fall back on? And at the time, in the 1930s, conservation's toolbox was pretty limited. There was regulations and legal protection, but there were also economic incentives, especially during this period when Leopold is coming back to the Midwest. There were lots of federal government, for the most part, attempts to basically coerce landowners into doing the right things on their land by offering them financial incentives. And Leopold, all for this, he was a participant, actually one of the principal participants in the first watershed scale project in the Midwest, not far from here, over in Coon Valley. And working with that, he saw the potential benefits of rewarding private landowners who did the right thing on their property. But he quickly decided that's not going to be a long-term solution, because he observed that once the incentives and subsidies stop, people go right back to their old practices. It wasn't enduring. It wasn't going to last. So again, pivoting, the painless path of incentives and subsidies not only fails to lead us to land conservation, but sometimes actually retards the growth of critical intelligence on the whereabouts of alternative routes. That's it. The toolbox is empty now, so Leopold had to come up with something new. We tried to get conservation by buying land, subsidizing desirable changes in land use, and passing restrictive laws. The last method largely failed. The other two have produced only small samples of success. Something new had to be done. And of course, Leopold was going to be the person to come up with that idea. And he starts to think about this, and he makes a key observation. He describes it as the key log. This is a term that is kind of lost in modern lexicon, but back in that day when we were still logging vast areas and floating big rafts of logs down rivers, it only took one or two logs to jam up and the whole raft came to a stop. So the task was to find that one log that was holding things back. And for Leopold, again, using common terminology of the day, said the key log is there's yet no social stigma in the possession of a gullied farm, a wrecked forest, or a polluted stream, provided the dividends suffice to send the youngsters to college. In other words, we're thinking about land strictly as a commodity, strictly as an economic value, and there is no ethic really governing our relationship with land. And Leopold comes up with what is a very novel idea, and that is that our approach to land conservation has to be based on ethics. We seem ultimately always thrown back on individual ethics as the basis of conservation. It's hard to make a man by pressure of law or money do a thing which does not spring naturally from his own personal sense of right and wrong. So, there again, Leopold, just amazing that he can wrap a concept up so neatly in a single sentence. There it is, that we need an ethical approach. And Leopold is going to be the architect of that, what he called his land ethic. that the land ethic reflects the existence of an ecological conscience, a moral compass, and this in turn reflects a conviction of individual responsibility for the health of the land. Health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. Conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. This sounds very modern. It sounds like stuff that, you know, the Natural Resource Conservation Service is saying to people today. And although Leopold, and this is now in a Sand County Almanac, so this is literally at the end result of his life journey, because he's going to die a year before the Sand County Almanac appears in print. But he did leave us a gift in the essay, A Land Ethic, in which he gives us a golden rule. Golden rules are these wonderful maxims, a simple little phrase often that can guide you in making ethical decisions. And many of you will know this one. Quit thinking about decent land use solely as an economic problem. Examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. I'm surprised somebody doesn't have it on a coffee mug or a t-shirt. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So there it is, you know, the simple maxim to live by, according to Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Well, the situation has not changed since Aldo Leopold died in 1948. Private land is still an incredibly important piece of the conservation puzzle for our country. And it's pretty obvious why. The lower 48 states, 3/4 of the land is in private ownership. You simply don't have enough public land in the US, especially in the lower 48. You simply don't have enough public land to accomplish modern conservation goals. The pieces are too small, they're too far apart from one another. They were never created with the idea of preserving biological diversity or keeping things functioning. There's also issues like most of the rain that falls in the US falls on privately owned land. Not surprising, that land is converted to agriculture because of that rain. But the rain doesn't stay on the land it falls on. It washes off into our waterways, carrying with it, of course, all kinds of things that are detrimental to the aquatic community. We also know that now that we have endangered species lists, that 40% of the US endangered species and threatened species are probably going to survive or not, depending on what we do to their habitat on privately owned land. And of that privately owned land, we're losing millions of acres that are in natural and semi-natural conditions that are providing habitat essentially for wildlife as it's converted mostly to agriculture, but to urban sprawl and other human uses. So that's the message from Aldo Leopold. What does this have to do with monarch butterflies? Well, I think you've figured it out already. Monarch butterflies are probably going to survive or go extinct depending on what we do on privately owned lands in the US. We simply don't have a way forward for monarch butterflies without the cooperation of private landowners. And I suspect you're all familiar with the monarch butterfly's fairly complex life cycle that includes a dependence on milkweeds as a host plant for its developing caterpillars to feed on. Monarch butterflies, of course, are also nectar feeders, so they need to have lots of nectar-producing plants in the environment to provide fuel. And for the monarch butterfly, that's really critical during the other phase of their life cycle, which is a long-distance migration, in which they need to have available sources of nectar to refuel them on the way. So monarch butterflies are very sensitive to what's happening on the landscape, not only in terms of their requirements for reproduction, having lots of milkweeds on the landscape, but also that there be enough nectar-producing plants out there that they can feed themselves and refuel during their migration movements. And the annual cycle is incredibly complicated. You all know that they winter in central Mexico. So if we started, I'm not sure this will work on, no, it won't work on a screen, but if you start over in the upper left there with the wintering season, when they're wintering in Mexico, early in the year, those butterflies that have overwintered in Mexico start their journey north. And that journey north involves a complicated series of adult stages, generations essentially of monarch butterflies as they work their way north. The survivors of that overwinter period, which they're struggling now because the overwintering area is being reduced in size by logging, it's being affected by climate change. So their overwinter survival is not nearly as good as it used to be. So when they start out in the spring, they've already sort of running at a deficit, you might say. So they arrive in the southern US where those survivors of the winter will reproduce. They have to have milkweeds there. They have to have an ability to kick off the new year's life cycle. If they reproduce successfully, the overwintering adults die, and their offspring, that first generation, moves further north. Again, finds a place to breed, breeds, dies. Their offspring move north again. You do this two more times until they reach late summer when they're up here in the northern fringes of the US and southern Canada, where the fourth sort of final generation of the year is going to be the combined product of all these three previous generations, building the population up so that that fourth generation is numerically strong, ready for that very rigorous high mortality migration back to Mexico. So it's a really difficult life cycle to maintain because any point along the way, if the animals don't achieve their numerical potential, they've jeopardized the rest of the entire year. So for the monarch butterflies, all of this is taking place in a very narrow landscape. It's often referred to as the monarch milkweed corridor. Most of what's happening is in this little cone that starts down in Mexico, and the animals work their way northward with the first couple of oh geez, what did I just do? Stepped on a cord. The first generation and second generation breeding in the southern portion of that monarch milkweed corridor, and the third and fourth up in the northern extreme of this corridor. But that's the landscape that we have to pay attention to, because it's not the only place that there are monarch butterflies. There are monarch butterflies out on the west coast, but the bulk of them are using this monarch milkweed corridor to complete their life cycle. So what's happening within that monarch milkweed corridor? Some of it reflects the fact of, well, why? Why have they decided to stake their fate on this narrow corridor? And the answer to that is simply looking at the distribution of milkweeds. The central part of the country is rich in milkweed species. So if you were going to plot an itinerary for the type of trip that they're going to make and the need to reproduce multiple times, well, that's probably where you would do it on the landscape, because historically, naturally, this was an area very, very rich in milkweed, which obviously is necessary for their reproduction. Anybody have a guess how many milkweed species we have in Wisconsin?
Native ones? Or
Native, well, include a non-native, yeah.
6 to 10.
14. 14. And we're not, as you saw on the map, we're not the richest spot on the monarch milkweed corridor, but we got a lot of milkweed. Some of them obviously more valuable to monarchs for reproduction than others, but still a lot of choices for them in a lot of different types of habitat. And if you're familiar with them, maybe fortunately milkweeds, although farmers hate them, they're attractive plants. Like monarch butterflies, it's not hard to like milkweeds because they're really quite attractive. So That Monarch Milkweed Corridor obviously is where we're going to focus on how private lands are essentially controlling the fate of the monarch butterfly. And everything that we know about monarch butterflies reveals that things are not going well at all. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen graphs like this. Here's the most recent picture of what's been happening to the monarch butterfly population in Mexico, where they're annually censused based on, you can't count them individually, but they estimate the volume of trees that the monarch butterflies are roosting in. And as you can see, it's a very alarming trend. And reflecting that and the very real possibility that this is essentially a trajectory toward extinction in the not too distant future. Just last year, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they're the organization, the worldwide organization that publishes the global red list, the sort of official global catalog of endangered species. They took the move and declared the monarch butterfly an endangered species globally. We've still been dragging our feet here in the US. They are not yet listed as threatened or endangered under our Endangered Species Act. They're a candidate species, which means that the federal government is thinking about it. And the thinking is supposed to end next year when they make their decision on whether to list the monarch butterfly or not. Part of the foot dragging has to do with the fact that if the monarch butterfly is in fact listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act, the federal government would be required to name a recovery team. And the recovery team, one of their first tasks would be to identify critical habitat for the monarch butterfly. Critical habitat for the monarch butterfly is on private lands. Private lands, big federal legislation like the Endangered Species Act has become a boogeyman for private landowners who consider it to be a threat to their private property rights. So there's a great deal of sort of hand-wringing about, is this really the right thing to do? Are we going to make forward progress by coming down with regulations on private landowners? We're sort of reinventing the hesitancy that Aldo Leopold had back in the 1920s. Can you really do this by a heavy-handed, top-down approach? But we'll decide next year. In any event, there's the picture. There's the corridor. It's 98% private land. And the little patches of state and federal land that are embedded in the corridor are tiny, isolated from one another, often actually not even providing the type of habitat that would be very helpful to monarch butterflies. So therein is the dilemma, that private lands really do hold the future of the main portion of the monarch butterfly population. So what's going on in that area? Well, lots of things obviously have gone wrong for monarch butterflies. Remember how crucial that first generation of breeders is after they've gone through the decline in numbers over the winter and the survivors have worked their way north. That first generation has to kick things off successfully. Unfortunately, with climate change and to some extent land use, that area has been experiencing long-term persistent drought. And as a result, the milkweed populations there are not as numerous or widespread as they once had been, in addition to the destruction of milkweeds that goes along with agriculture. So the first generation gets off to a rough start, essentially, because of climate change and what's happening there in terms of drought. And climate change is still going to have an impact. Remember, with climate change, as things warm, essentially most habitats are gradually shifting north. So the fourth generation is now finding suitable habitat further and further north than it used to. The wintering area in Mexico is not moving north. It's shifting up the sides of mountains as things move, as things warm, but it's not shifting north. So it means now, and increasingly in the future, the fourth generation is facing an even longer migration than in the past to get to central Mexico. And obviously that trip, they suffer a lot of mortality, so the longer the trip, the worse the mortality. The other thing that they said is, you know, the habitat is changing, not only just because of climate change, but there's also conversion to cropland. So if we look at what's happening again in the corridor, and you look at the information from the USDA about habitat conversion to cropland, and you can see that throughout the corridor, and perhaps especially up here, where the third and fourth generation are going to be reproducing, that a lot of land that was in pastures, for example, or in some type of habitat that was conducive to supporting milkweeds is now being converted to row crops. Again, not helping the monarch butterfly, especially now for the third and fourth generation. Add to that what it's being converted to. Most of it, of course, is being converted to corn, with government subsidies encouraging more and more conversion to corn for ethanol production. But obviously, you know, we're seeing a lot more corn on the landscape. And of course, along with corn, growing of corn, comes the problem of weed control. And corn being one of the crops in which weed control has reached the high-tech level of herbicide resistance being bred into the corn. This area is where we apply more herbicide and indeed other agricultural chemicals than anywhere else in the country. And the use of Roundup-ready corn, the use of the Roundup, the glyphosate, a non-selective herbicide, means that what Leopold in his day called clean farming, which was the result of plowing, now becomes chemically clean farming, where milkweeds and other plants that used to coexist with agriculture are now being eliminated. And some of the other chemicals that are being used in agriculture are not just reducing the abundance of both milkweeds and nectar-producing plants that used to be associated with agriculture, but we're now producing new classes of insecticides like the neonicotinoids that are very non-selective insect-killing agents that unfortunately are not going to discriminate the monarch butterfly from Lepidoptera that are pests on corn, for example. So we've just got a host of things that are just going the wrong direction totally within this crucial piece of landscape. And unfortunately, not a lot of hopeful signs that any of that is going to change anytime in the future. So where do you go from here? For monarch conservation, obviously the key is private land, getting private landowners to do the right things and provide the monarch butterflies with the things that they need to thrive. And there are certainly opportunities to expand monarch habitat on private land. Some of it even on very small parcels of land. People using native plants for landscaping, for gardening, specifically planting those attractive milkweeds for reproduction and producing nectar, raising nectar-producing plants. And it's really quite remarkable. How many of you have done pollinator gardens and so on? It's really remarkable. You know, the old, what was the movie, The Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come. It's amazing. These monarch butterflies, when they're roaming around the countryside, they'll find even tiny little patches of what they're looking for, which is milkweeds and nectar. The edges of farm fields. This is a huge area in the Midwest that technically does not need to be cleared of vegetation in order for agriculture to be successful. So the edges of farm fields provide places where, again, native plants, milkweeds, and nectar producers can exist. Fallow land. We still do have fallow lands. Agriculture, even though it's intense, does still rotate. And fallow lands, again, if the vegetation is managed properly, can provide a lot of opportunities for raising plants. Finally, there are public and private right-of-ways. These are kind of the sleeper issues that people weren't really thinking about. All these roadsides, railroad right-of-ways, power line right-of-ways, gas line right-of-ways. All of these are areas where we intensely manage the vegetation, but we don't manage it in a way that's producing plants that are going to help the monarch butterfly. So looking at these, landscaping with native wildflowers, fortunately, is taking off. There are literally, looking at the latest things that I could find online, there are literally tens of thousands of people in the Monarch Milkweed Corridor that are doing native plant gardening. And that's a good thing, because a garden like that, it's just a crucial way station for migrating monarchs and can even provide breeding habitat for them. The edges of fallow farm fields, this is a challenge because it's sort of going against the culture of Midwestern farming. Traditionally, milkweed were viewed as a really noxious weed. And the reason, as we all know, is that milkweed seeds are airborne. They're dispersed in the wind. And they don't really germinate very well unless they happen to eventually land on bare soil. So with the plowed fields of the Midwest, every fall, milkweed seeds drifted all over the landscape, and come the next year, farmers had milkweeds in their fields and worked hard to eliminate them. Well, now, of course, especially with the use of herbicide and low-till or no-till farming, it's possible to very efficiently control milkweeds in your actual cropland if you wish to, but it leaves the edges of farm fields where there's really no need for farmers to be exercising lots of control over the vegetation. But the culture is that you get rid of milkweeds and other noxious plants when they're around the field. And woe be to the neighbor who doesn't keep, the edges of his fields or roadsides, clear of these noxious weeds. But there's tremendous opportunity for farmers to basically quit killing things in this area that's of no particular economic importance to them, but could make a big difference to lots of species, including monarch butterflies. And then there's the highway right-of-ways. I mean, this country is basically crisscrossed with highways, and every one of them has a right-of-way. And those right-of-ways, again, are intensively managed. We spend, I wouldn't even guess how much money is spent mowing the sides of highways and herbiciding the sides of highways. And once again, this is sort of like the farmers and their culture of discriminating against milkweeds. It's not a big deal for safety. It's just, well, that's the way we've always done it. I know every year I had the conversation with the guy who was hired to mow the roadsides in the township where I lived. And every year we had the same conversation. He said, yeah, I'd sure like to help you preserve those milkweeds. But he said, the town wants the roadsides clean, and they pay me to do it. But there it is, 40 acres for every mile of state or federal highway. It's a big area, and especially when you look at the map and you look at how much highway right-of-way is in the corridor, it's over 8,000 square miles of highway right-of-ways. All we need to do is change our culture of how we manage the vegetation on those right-of-ways, and we not only have a huge area of habitat that could be helping monarchs, but it's nicely distributed. It's essentially throughout the corridor. It's always going to be there for especially the migrating monarchs. And some states are actually, moving ahead on this. Illinois, in particular, has quite an ambitious program of whenever a roadside right-of-way sort of gets replanted, of going with native species, including, I mean, this one, they maybe went a little overboard on, on milkweed, but you get the point, you know, that it's pretty easy to establish it, and once it is established, it becomes a low maintenance issue. So you actually save money in the long run. So this sort of steadily catching on, that right-of-ways have potential, and state and federal agencies are starting to come on board cooperating. There's also the railroad right-of-ways. Again, you know, the railroads spend a lot of money managing the vegetation in their right-of-ways. Mostly they now do it with some really noxious herbicides, some of the worst non-selective herbicides that basically kill everything in their right-of-way. And it's a big right-of-way. Generally, it's 100 feet. So when you start to look, and you probably all know that here in the state of Wisconsin, some of our best remnant prairies are in railroad right-of-ways because those areas were never plowed, and at least until recently weren't controlled with herbicides, and as a result become havens for native plants. And they can, once again, if the railroads would change their culture and manage the vegetation there in a way that was more conducive to wildlife. And once again, there's 750 square miles of railroad right-of-ways within the Monarch Corridor. And if you just look, you know, the Monarch Corridor has more railroad right-of-ways than any other part of the country. And again, it's well distributed. It's throughout the corridor, so it provides the type of ready access that's necessary, especially for migrants. We're not done yet. There's pipelines, crisscrossing. If you've ever looked at a Google aerial view of the country, you realize we're crisscrossed with all these pipelines of various kinds. And again, it's a 50-foot wide corridor, and you can see what they do to it. They basically manage it like it's a golf course. They mow it, they herbicide it, they basically keep the vegetation low and simple, and again, could easily be managed in a different way. And once again, if those companies were interested in doing it, this could be a real boon, because it is really all over the place in the Monarch Corridor. It provides the distribution and abundance, 1,500 square miles of right-of-ways, of pipelines that could easily be converted. And we're not done yet. We've got transmission lines. And again, we do exactly the same thing with transmission lines. These are really wide. I mean, they're 250 feet or more wide. And for the most part, if it's not being tilled and used for agriculture underneath, again, it's managed for very simple vegetation. It's mowed, it's herbicided, and doesn't provide much of use to wildlife or monarchs. And once again, if you look at transmission lines, where is the densest concentration in the country? It's right in the Monarch Milkweed Corridor. So lots of opportunities there. 2,500 square miles of habitat. You start to add this up and you realize there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of opportunities out there, but it involves convincing private owners, whether that's agriculture, utilities, state and federal governments, railroads. It's convincing all of them to become partners in this effort and essentially do the right thing. So Aldo Leopold recognized if we're going to do this, it's probably going to be based on a change in ethics. It's going to be changed it's going to happen because of a change in attitudes. It's going to be changed perhaps with generations of owners, of businesses deciding they want to do the right thing for the environment. And many are, no question about it. More and more are signing on to these practices that we've been talking about here again and again. So we're making progress slowly, and it may be too slow, really, for the Monarch Butterfly. And I've sort of implied, you know, in the early part of the lecture that Aldo Leopold, you know, he was not only, you know, a really amazing conservation thinker, but it always amazes me how far ahead of his time he was, that many of the things that he was writing about the rest of us didn't catch on to for decades after he had given us the crucial wisdom. I mean, not the least of which is Sand County Almanac. That's a good example of Leopold being ahead of his time. Leopold had a hard time getting Sand County Almanac published. 5 different publishers rejected it. And they all said the same thing. We don't think there's any readership for this type of book. Or if they were willing to reconsider, they said, maybe if you would expand the first half of those books, those nice little natural history essays, and get rid of all that ecology and philosophical stuff in the second half of the book, we might reconsider. Well, Oxford University Press took a gamble, and the others were right. Sand County Almanac was a total bust, hardly sold at all, until Oxford University Press did something that was either brilliant marketing or dumb luck. They came out with a paperback edition in 1966, just when the modern environmental movement was really gathering steam, and suddenly, 20 years after Leopold had written this stuff, there was an audience ready to read it and understand. And sales of a Sand County Almanac have just been exponential ever since. So, being ahead of his time, here's what Leopold had to say about the problem that we've just been discussing. There are idle spots on every farm, and every highway is bordered by an idle strip as long as it is. Keep cow, plow, and mowers out of these idle spots, and the full native flora, plus dozens of interesting stowaways from foreign parts, could be part of the normal environment of every citizen. And you would do that, basically, out of ethical consideration for what we're doing to species like the monarch butterfly. So what should we do? Well, obviously restoring milkweed and nectar-producing plants is a big part of the issue. There's also things, of course, about protecting the wintering areas and so on, and reversing the habitat losses that have occurred, both in the wintering area as well as throughout the corridor. There are literally tens of millions of owners and managers that need to be contacted. They need to be pleaded with. They need to be educated. And it requires people who care to take the time to make that effort. The agricultural industry, obviously, again, is a group that needs to be approached at the highest level and at the sort of grassroots level to change some of their cultural practices. And you see it happening on the landscape. There's no question. Wisconsin is a great example of the changes that are occurring, again, out of environmental ethical concerns. And then there's the owners and managers of those right-of-ways. 13,000 square miles that could be in useful habitat. But again, somebody has to make the pitch, somebody has to put the pressure on to make that change in what we've always done. And the folks who are doing it is the Monarch joint venture. This is a highly successful effort modeled after the effort that was done to restore wetlands for migratory waterfowl. Joint ventures reaching out to all of the players who have a stake in the case of waterfowl, wetland habitat, in the case of monarch butterflies, their habitat. There are now literally hundreds, you can't fit all the logos on the page anymore, from federal and state governments to NGOs, to private groups, to towns and villages, of people who have signed up and say, yes, we're willing to do what it takes to make these changes to help the monarch butterfly. It's a complete package. I know some of you how many of you have visited the website and found out? It's a toolbox. There's plenty of information there about, literature that you can hand out to people, ways that you can encourage it, sources of seeds and so on. It's just a rich source of information on how to do conservation, but also, just really cool information about monarch butterflies. I mean, now you can sort of track their progress coming north. And I just looked last week, and they're showing up in Wisconsin now. They've already made it up here. Have any of you seen any this year? Yeah, there's a few reports. Yeah, there's a few reports. But in any event, that's the place to go for everything that you need to know about monarch conservation. And I want to end here with, again, some words of wisdom from Aldo Leopold that, again, very succinctly summarizes the challenge that we face in planning a future for monarch butterflies. Planning for wildlife is not primarily a matter of laws, appropriations, or administrative devices, but rather of modifying land use so as to provide the habitat needed by each species. One sentence sums it up really nicely. So thank you, and I'm here because of Badger Talks, so I have to tell them thank you for setting this up. So yes, feel free, questions. Yeah.
With the right-of-ways, aren't some of those left open so that there can be vehicle access in case a pipeline breaks or in case a transmission line needs some sort of servicing? And how do you allow for that while still providing more vegetation?
Yeah, the question is, how do you convert their current sort of clean management of right-of-ways to something with a little more diversity in it? And generally the argument is that what we're proposing is not in any way an impedance to your access to your railroad track, your pipeline, your whatever. It's low-lying herbaceous material. It can
drive over it,
no consequence. Especially with the vehicles that they use for maintenance. What you want to keep out is woody vegetation. And that means, managing by strategically, seasonally appropriate mowing, or even better, fire, which, some of these companies that own right-of-ways are doing that. Roadsides, for example, are often being burned. But it's just a matter of changing the culture of how they manage it in a way that suits their needs, but also suits the needs of wildlife. It's that, when public-private, when both are better by virtue of the partnership, we've got conservation. Yeah.
I guess maybe one question and one observation. So around here, I have heard that a big justification for mowing the roadsides is to make it easier to avoid deer collisions when deer jump out, and if you've got this 12-foot thing, maybe you'll see the deer early enough and be able to avoid a crash. And
there's not a lot of data supporting that. It's conventional wisdom, the idea that you have to have wide mowed roadsides to prevent deer collisions. Most of what would be helpful to monarch butterflies, you see deer. The deer are above that. So, it's not as though they're hidden in brushy vegetation. And again, it's how you manage it to keep it in a state that satisfies both the need for safety, for snow plowing, whatever. And when you consider when most of the deer collisions happen in Wisconsin, it's long after the monarchs have left. So mowing, if you're going to mow late in the year, before the rut, before the fall season, when there's a lot of movement around the landscape. And then you're set for the winter, for snow plowing, and you're all set for spring as well.
okay, and then just the other thing, so an issue about the utility right-of-ways, we've had on our property, the electric company comes through without notice. They don't need to give us notice, right?
Oh, they've got it right away.
Yeah, and one time they just mowed like crazy. Another time they herbicided a whole bunch of willows that had grown up under the power lines. And one fellow had been planting native plants under that right-of-way, only to see that it gets mowed in the middle of the summer, and all of his efforts to provide that habitat was ruined. So observation.
Takes a lot of people to
Yeah.
let their views be known. And there are complications. I mean, I don't mean to simplify, what this is. I mean, all my conversations with the guy that mowed the roadsides in my township, he said, people also complain about real invasive species like wild parsnip. And he said, if I wait until late in the season to mow, I'm spreading parsnip seeds all over the place. So, there are considerations. It's not a real simple solution, but anything moving in the right direction obviously will help a lot. And there's so much space to do it in. That's the amazing thing,
Yeah, so if you see a long patch of wild parsnip, sure, mow it.
Yeah,
But don't mow the whole thing.
yeah,
No.
yeah. Yeah.
So a question, so all these things that we can do here in the United States, but is that not a moot point if we don't change what's happening in Mexico? Like what is happening? Is there any effort there to do anything? I mean, it's obviously there's other issues there that we don't deal with, but like what's happening there?
Yeah, it's not great news there. As I said, climate change means that the exact sort of temperature, moisture regime that these monarchs need to conserve energy over the winter is gradually sort of moving upslope. And as that happens, you're just geometrically running out of space and room. But there's also the fact that those primarily coniferous forests are being logged. And even though some of it has been designated as reserves by federal and state governments in Mexico, the poaching is rampant. And, the efforts to try to expand the habitat have met with all kinds of issues that maybe are sort of not unexpected in a country like Mexico. One of the big groups that had been raising a lot of money and replanting forest land, reforesting, discovered that the nurserymen that they had been paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to raise these plants and get them out on the landscape had been reselling them to timber companies. And they're being planted on timberland rather than on the areas that were designated for planting. So yeah, Mexico's a big deal. But Mexico, honestly, they're doing what they can. And, there's some hope, actually now, with climate change, that there may be some inkling of an indication that the fourth generation of migrants are wintering further north, that they're finding little spots of habitat that they can winter in. So maybe they are adapting. Yes?
I think you correctly focused on private lands, but there is quite a bit of public land in terms of schools and county facilities, state buildings, and even private churches where big yards part of that could be planted with the plants that we need. Right?
Yeah, and for most part, those are tiny, so it really amounts to the native plant gardening there, where you're maintaining a sort of a well-manicured native wildflower garden. So it's not quite the same as what you're doing, out in the countryside. But absolutely, I mean, like I said, even your quarter-acre urban lot with a native wildflower garden will attract pollinators and monarch butterflies. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities, and school kids love this. Right. I mean, school kids all over the Midwest especially are given the seeds and instructions on how to do it. And it's amazing how many schoolyards actually do have a little native wildflower garden going. And of course, the lesson that goes along with it, which is probably as important as their little garden.
Right.
Yes?
Yeah, is there kind of a gap between where they are in Mexico, that climate change and trying to move north doesn't really have much forest, like West Texas or whatever? How far do they have to jump?
Well, they can't go that far. I mean, these are individuals that have been through the mill. I mean, they've made the journey south, they've overwintered, they've suffered, tremendous mortality throughout that period.
Can you stop them in Oklahoma?
Yeah, they've literally got to stop. I mean, they can't make it too much further north, not only because of their physical condition, but because of weather. Remember, they're doing this pretty early in the spring, so.
I'm talking about the fall migration.
Oh, fall migration.
Stop them.
Ah, okay,
If
yeah.
you stop them further north, is there habitat potential?
Not much until you get to the Sierras in Mexico. So when you get to the Sierras, when you get some elevation, is where you get that right combination of temperature being fairly constant and fairly high humidity that they need. So the other place, I mean, you're probably all familiar, you know, there's a western population, and, you know, they've settled in again on the coniferous stands around Monterey, California, because that area provides exactly the same thing, moderate, pretty stable temperatures and fairly high humidity. That population is holding its own, actually increasing a bit. But it's not the major part of the monarch population at all. But yeah, you need just those special conditions, and it just happens to be that it's in Mexico and we don't have any of it, especially in Texas. Yeah, yeah. Yes?
I'll just make a comment. So I started raising butterfly monarchs in I have a little garden, which is actually, I certified it as a Monarch way station now, so you can go and certify your
Yeah.
native area. But it turned into me now deciding to raise swallowtails. So I have the thing is there when people say, like they overwinter, right? So
Yeah.
monarchs go south.
Yeah.
But I have swallowtails that are still sitting in their chrysalises that overwintered from, I think they went in probably October.
Yeah.
And they're still sitting there. So when people around here, when people like fire, you know, like will burn their dry leaves and stuff like that, I just cringe because I think about my swallowtails. What, you know, you're trying to save the monarchs, right? And then, but I also have a garden that brings in the other types of butterflies too. So I'm
Yeah.
trying to like the swallowtails, and so I just don't know. There's just seems to be a lot of conservation, you know, education, right? Because it's monarchs are very important because they have a, as we saw, the path. They have a long flight to go, but it's even conservation around things that stay here too in the Midwest, and how do we preserve for them?
We're lucky we've got monarch butterflies because they are the flagship for pollinators.
Right.
Everybody cares about them. Everybody not everybody recognizes a swallowtail or feels the same sort of affection for them. But the monarch butterfly carries a lot of other pollinators, you know, on their wings. But yeah, keeping butterfly chrysalises over the winter is just amazing.
I have a butterfly house that stays out.
Yeah. Yeah, that was, I know in my childhood, that was
Yeah.
clearly one of those awesome things that I
And
experienced.
I didn't realize that until I still started having dill. So they like dill, they like the carrots, right? The
Yeah.
butterflies will land. And I started getting those, and I was like, oh, this is.
That's a great thing for school kids too, because, you know, I know, you know, probably many of you did that when you were kids, you know. Sometimes I did it with Lepidoptera. I was encouraged. One of my childhood mentors was Rachel Carson, and she was the one who encouraged me to find chrysalises and keep them. And you know, my parents thought that was a nice thing to do. They were not so thrilled when I collected praying mantis egg cases and brought them into the house and put them in my desk drawer and forgot about them. And about Christmas time, they hatched, and there were hundreds of thousands of baby praying mantises on every square inch of the house. But yeah, it's a real treat. I know, you know, where I've lived for the last 40 years, we would usually get 1 or 2 chrysalises and we'd put it out on our screen porch and let it hatch and then release the animals in the spring. And one spring, we were a little late catching the emergence of a Cecropia. It was a female. When we finally discovered that, oh, she's already emerged, the outside of the porch was covered with dozens of male Cecropia moths. that had picked up her pheromones and wanted at her for sure. So we felt, oh my gosh, if we release her, she's going to be mobbed. But yeah, it was a great idea, and again, you know.
There was one summer I had about close to 100 that I raised. So I mean, a little pot, and I live in town, so a little pot of.
There's so much we can do, and for the most part, a lot of it is fun to do, and you know, has great benefits. So it should be fun. It shouldn't be a burden. So native wildflower gardening, I mean, it should be a joy to do. Watching animals go through their life cycle should be a joy, not a burden. All right, well, thank you all. Maybe go out and look for some migratory birds on Migratory Bird Day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.